please take your Bibles and join me in Genesis 25. Genesis 25. I preached 7 verses last week, so I thought I would be merciful today, and we'll just do 11. Genesis 25, 1 through 11. If you're using the blue ESV Bible in the seatbacks in front of you, you can find our text on page 19. And the title of our sermon is Abraham, a Retrospective. There's a line that I've seen from A.A. Milne via Winnie the Pooh that I think serves as a good opening thought for us this morning. It says, "How lucky I am to have something that makes saying goodbye so hard." Now, we might take umbrage with the word lucky, but as it is, I think we can appreciate this thought as we, in some very real sense, say goodbye to Abraham today. We have been nearly every week since January walking with this man as he followed the Lord out of Ur of the Chaldeans to sojourn in the promised land of Canaan in the hope of the promise of God that would really not even be fulfilled in his lifetime. Yes, God did give Abraham a son through whom the promise and the blessing would come, but it would not be for many years after Abraham's death that the promise of God would in full come to pass. And yet, what we've seen in Abraham, in his life, ever since the very end of Genesis 11, the beginning of Genesis 12, we've seen him trust the Lord. We've seen Abraham follow where the Lord was leading. We have seen him obey the commands of God. And yet we've not learned all that there is to know about our forefather in the faith. There's much that we could learn about him that we're not told, but we're told very specific things, and we've come to this point now in the narrative of Genesis that we see the text making a major transition from Abraham to his son Isaac. Abraham's wife Sarah has died. Abraham then saw to it that Isaac got married, and then, as we saw last week, toward the end of Genesis 24, the text identifies Isaac as the master. And today we conclude the Abrahamic narrative, which is, it's one of those generational sections. It began all the way back at the end of chapter 11, the generations of Terah. So ever since then, we've been thinking about the generations of Terah, focused on Abraham, and it will conclude with verse 11. And then next week, we'll, in brief, see the generations of Ishmael as well as the beginnings of the generations of Isaac. And so let me read these verses here about Abraham. These first 11 verses will give an outline of the sermon and then get to work. We read, "Abraham took another wife, whose name was Keturah. She bore him Zimran, Jokshan, Midian, Ishbak, and Shua. Jokshan fathered Sheba and Dedan. The sons of Dedan were Asherim, Latushim, and Leumim. The sons of Midian were Ephah, Epher, Hanok, Abida, and Eldah. All these were the children of Keturah. Abraham gave all he had to Isaac, but to the sons of his concubines Abraham gave gifts, and while he was still living, he sent them away from his son Isaac eastward to the east country. These are the days of the years of Abraham's life, 175 years. Abraham breathed his last and died in a good old age, an old man and full of years, and he was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, his sons, buried him in the cave of Machpelah in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar, the Hittite, east of Mamre, the field that Abraham purchased from the Hittites. Then Abraham was buried with Sarah, his wife. After the death of Abraham, God blessed Isaac his son, and Isaac settled at Beer Lahairoi. Well, there are really just two parts to this sermon this morning. Well, three if you include some closing application, but two parts to the text that we're going to examine. First, in verses 1 to 6, we see the children born to Abraham by a woman named Keturah. And we'll consider that relationship. And then second, in verses 7 through 11, Abraham dies and is buried with Sarah. Let's look in the first place at verses 1 to 6, where we see an additional family tree has bloomed from Abraham. Verse 1 tells us that Abraham took another wife whose name was Keturah. Well, some have speculated that this Keturah is Hagar, returned from her wilderness wanderings, remarried to Abraham and given a new name. But since Hagar probably would have been about 85 years old at this point, and is explicitly mentioned below in the generations of Ishmael, it seems strange that she should be called simply by another name here, particularly since there's no explanation given or indication that that would be the case. And this section seems intent to distinguish these sons born to Abraham from others, Isaac and Ishmael. So Keturah is not Hagar, but another woman, but it is a question to ask, when did they get married? Now, perhaps some of you may be thinking that this is a very silly question. They got married right after Sarah died, right? Well, maybe. The truth is we can't be sure when they got married, and I have a point in bringing this up that we'll see shortly. But the fact is that she bore Abraham 6 children, and that at least points away from the idea that they got married after Sarah's death, since Abraham would have been 137 years old when Sarah died. Of course, it's not impossible that Abraham had 6 more children born to him after Sarah died, but the Bible is it's fairly insistent that the birth of Isaac was a miracle, not only because of Sarah's age, but also because of Abraham's. More than once, he's referred to as good as dead at 100 years old. And so if he's 100 years old when Isaac was born, it's a little strange to think that now, almost 40 years later, he's fathering 6 more children over the course of these many years. Now, some have noted that this is simply an indication that God had blessed Abraham in his latter years. He had invigorated him, and he had given him many children by this younger woman. And that's certainly possible. There are a couple of considerations to point out here. Though, first of all, she's called a wife in verse 1, but she's also called a concubine in verse 6. 1 Chronicles 1:32 explicitly names her as such, more directly naming Keturah as Abraham's concubine. Now, this may simply mean that he didn't hold her as in higher regard as he did Sarah. Sarah was his one true love. After she died, he gets remarried, and he didn't quite view her in the way that he had Sarah. But it may also mean that he had actually married her sometime during Sarah's life, as he had Hagar. And verse 6 is now simply describing the children that they had together and how Abraham treated them. He gave them gifts, and while he was living, he sent them away from Isaac. Now, someone will protest perhaps. Sarah died in Genesis 23. We're reading about this in Genesis 25. Ergo, he married Keturah after Sarah's death. But there's a problem with insisting that this is written from a precise chronological order. And here we begin to come to the point. For one, the statement Abraham took another wife could simply be translated as Abraham had taken another wife. And it was at some undisclosed point of time that this happened. And we are simply being told about it now for other reasons than chronology. And it's important, a second thing to note here is that Genesis 25, 1 through 11, is certainly not written 100% entirely chronological as it concerns the rest of the Genesis narrative. Because what happens immediately after this scene is that we learn of Isaac's children being born, Esau and Jacob. We learn in 25:20 and in verse 26 that Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, and he was 60 years old when they had children. 20 years elapsing between the marriage and the bearing of children. But verse 7 tells us that Abraham was 175 years old. So he was 100 when Isaac was born, 140 when he married Rebekah. I'm not a math genius, but that means he would have only been 160 when Esau and Jacob were born. But their births are recorded after Abraham's death, even though he would have lived for 15 years after they were born. And so the point of all of this is at least twofold. One, we need to make sure we are aware when we read the Bible, when we read historical narrative in particular, we need to be aware to highlight the fact that the Bible often tells stories as different from the way that we might tell them. For whatever reason, I think we tend to expect biblical narrative to be fairly strictly chronological. This happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. Tell me the story in the XYZ fashion. Don't give me the YZX of it. I don't want to know that. Start with the beginning, move to the middle, and then finish with the end. Perhaps it's because that we don't read Hebrew and Greek, and so we don't read the Bible quite in the way that it was often wrote originally or would have been read originally, and so it's hard to detect disorder, chronological disorder. I'm using that term sort of loosely, disorder here, chronological disorder for the sake of literary or theological order. Now, generally, this doesn't prove too disastrous for us, because at the end of the day, does it really matter when Abraham married Keturah? Is it going to radically change or upend our faith if he married her before or after Sarah's death? Probably not. So I don't think we need to die on any hill about the timeline here, but because we can't know for certain what the timeline was. But on the assumption that he did marry her sometime before Sarah died, why might the author have waited until now to tell us about her? Well, Gordon Wenham in his commentary in Genesis offers, I think, a quite helpful summary of why this marriage and these sons may not have been mentioned prior to now, if in fact this marriage and these births occurred chronologically prior to Sarah's death. This is what he writes. At which stage in Abraham's life he married Keturah is not stated, and indeed seems impossible to determine. Calvin suggested it occurred after Sarah had forced him to divorce Hagar back in chapter 21. Another commentator puts it that it was even earlier, before chapter 17 or even before chapter 14. But such conjecture contributes but little to the understanding of the account. The tradition that Abraham married Keturah had to be mentioned somewhere, and by including it here rather than elsewhere in the narrative, the author of Genesis was able to keep the focus undistractedly on the promise of Isaac and its fulfillment. Now it is slipped in here to complete the picture and to show how Abraham did indeed become a father of a multitude of nations. And so there are two things happening here by placing this part of the narrative at this juncture in the story. We've been able to focus almost exclusively on Isaac and the promise to him. We saw a piece of the thread of it from Ishmael, but we've been able to focus and see what God was doing to Abraham and through Abraham via Isaac. But now that we're coming to the end of Abraham's life, we see here a summary of how he had become a father of a multitude of nations. Now, of course, Abraham becomes a father of many nations in a spiritual sense through the gospel of Jesus Christ. And yet, as we look at these sons of Keturah, he also became a father of nations in a physical sense as well. And so we see how he relates to these sons. We were told he gives them gifts. He gives gifts to the sons of his concubines while he was living. He sent them away in, as we've noted, a foreboding eastward direction. But to Isaac, he gave all that he had. In other words, Isaac inherited Abraham's estate along with the blessing that God had promised to him. But Abraham was not indifferent to his other children. He gave them gifts before sending them away, which he did, as we saw with Ishmael. He sent them away in order to ensure Isaac's inheritance and blessing would remain unthreatened, as he was the child of promise. And so before we move on, I want to come back to an idea from last week's sermon about our responsibility to pass on the Lord's blessing to the next generation. Last week we saw that Abraham took the responsibility to seek a wife for Isaac, giving something of an approving nod to arranged marriages, by the way. Isaac, however, then sends his son Jacob to find a wife for himself. So there is more than one way to skin a cat, apparently. But what we see in Abraham there, in that narrative, is that he's taking the responsibility for future generations, and he's taking it seriously. He refuses to neglect his other children here. He ensures that God's program of bringing blessing to the world through Isaac is protected, but he gives gifts to his other sons. And so it raises questions for us. What are we doing to bless the next generation? A wise man, the proverb says, leaves an inheritance to his children's children. And as we've said, even commenting on that proverb, that it's not less than material financial inheritance, but it ought to be more than that. And so are we helping our children to become people who love what is good, what is true, what is beautiful? Are we helping them to become skillful in various types of labor, mental and physical, so that they can contribute substance to their families and communities? Are we helping our children to be the kinds of people that make for good spouses and parents? And I read a comment in a book this week by a woman who realized that at some fundamental level she was raising parents for her grandchildren. And do we think in those terms? Are we helping our children to think through what makes for a good spouse? Abraham found a wife for Isaac. Isaac gave Jacob helpful instructions for finding a wife for himself, as we'll see in the coming weeks. So we don't want to leave our children to fend for themselves in what I can only describe as an ever-twisting and devolving world of sexual confusion and rebellion in our culture, it seems. So Abraham, he sought to provide a resting place for Sarah after she died, and he sought to provide a means by which his son would be able to be married and to have children, that the blessing of God may continue. But here he also gives gifts to his other children. So are we setting our affairs in order? He did this while he was living. Are we setting our affairs in order while we are of sound mind and body? There are some things that must be attended to after our deaths, but there are things before our deaths that we can plan or purchase or prioritize while we yet live. We draft a will, estate planning, and the like are things that we can do in order to bless those who come after us. And so, in some sense, when we look at these opening verses, these first 6 verses of Genesis 25, we see that theme repeated, that Abraham here shows us the wisdom of prioritizing such things, so that conflict in his family could be mitigated as much as possible. He acts before he dies. But we see a second thing in verses 7 through 11, where Abraham then dies and is buried. He lived to a good old age, 175, I'd say so. That's pretty good. It's pretty old. And then he was gathered to his people. He breathed his last. He was gathered to his people. Isaac and Ishmael, they come back together and they bury him in the cave of Machpelah that we saw him purchase in chapter 23 in the field of Ephron, the son of Zohar the Hittite, east of Mamre. He was buried with Sarah. Abraham living to 175 years old means that he lived exactly 100 years in the promised land. He was 75 when God called him, and he went. Now his death is described somewhat interestingly here. We're told in verse 8 that he was gathered to his people. And that may simply be a reference to what follows. Isaac and Ishmael buried him in the cave with Sarah. But it's something of an odd expression if that's all it means, especially since Sarah is just one person. Several commentators believe that this is a reference to his soul being reunited with his forefathers. It would be something of a redundancy if both descriptions are referring to his burial. He was gathered to his people, and then he was, gathered to his people. So this may be, in fact, good evidence, as we see in many other places, in the Old Testament's belief in life after death. But in any case, these verses make something quite clear to us. No one is indispensable. Abraham eventually died. Abraham, Father Abraham. Yeah, he was 175, but then just like everybody else, he left the land of the living. And yet, God's purpose clearly continued. Verse 11, after Abraham's death, God blessed Isaac, his son. And Isaac settled down. And so, when we come to a passage like Genesis 25, 1 through 11, we shouldn't just ask ourselves, what am I doing to set the next generation up for success? But we should also ask ourselves, am I really at terms with the fact I'm not going to be around forever? And am I at terms with the fact, am I squared with the fact that I am not indispensable? There's not a single one of us here this morning that if dead would mean the end of God's kingdom. There isn't one of us here even that if dead would mean the end of Redeemer Baptist Church. Not me, not any of the elders or deacons or members, staff or otherwise. We each play different parts. And like when Abraham passed, right? When we pass, it will affect others. But no one is indispensable. If I get struck by lightning and die this year in one of our afternoon summer storms because I'm foolishly playing in the rain, RBC will go on. My family will go on. It's a hard pill to swallow. Not only am I going to die one day, not only are you going to die one day, but the world is going to continue spinning as if nothing had happened. Of course, there are some people whose personal worlds are turned upside down by the death of a loved one. But I'm not the glue holding the world together. Abraham wasn't the glue holding the world together. His death is evidence of this fact. No one is indispensable. If there's anybody thus far in the book of Genesis that we've met that you would think would need to hang about, it would be Abraham. Abraham, the friend of God, the one through whom God's blessing was going to come to the nations of the earth. He died. And then what? God blessed his son and carried the plan along. This doesn't call us to be indifferent to our own impending death or the death of someone else. It doesn't mean that God doesn't care about Abraham or anything like that. But it gives us an important perspective. No one's indispensable. And so I think we're helped along at least three parallel lines as we reflect on Abraham's death, particularly as it regards this point about indispensability. The first thing is that our dispensability, the fact that I can die and things go on, it should make us humble. Your dispensability should humble you. It shouldn't make you angry or fearful. It should make you humble. C.S. Lewis's chapter on the great sin and mere Christianity is a perennial read for me. He writes, "Pride has been the chief cause of misery in every nation and every family since the world began. Other vices may sometimes bring people together. You may find good fellowship and jokes and friendliness among drunken people or unchaste people. But pride always means enmity. It is enmity. And not only enmity between man and man, but enmity to God. In God, you come up against something that is in every respect immeasurably superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you do not know God at all. As long as you are proud, you cannot know God. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, as long as you are looking down, you cannot see something that is above you. We saw Abraham, at the end of chapter 21, call upon the name of the everlasting God when he planted that tamarisk tree in Beersheba. Abraham wasn't proud, looking down on others or other things. He was looking up. Abraham has died, but his God lives on to bless his son and the world through him. So our impending deaths must serve to confront our pride, our enmity against one another and against God himself. God is in every way, in every respect, superior to us. Death, they say, is the great equalizer. This is how Lewis describes the humble person there in that chapter. Do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, he will be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be a sort of greasy, smarmy person who is always telling you that, of course, he is nobody. Probably all you will think about him is that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. If you so dislike him, it will be because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so easily. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all. So in coming to terms with our own impending deaths, we don't merely need to think about ourselves as small, dirty objects in God's presence. But according to Lewis, and I think this is a helpful thought, we come not to think so much about ourselves at all. So when we see Abraham dying here, we don't need to become so hyper-focused on our own impending death, lamenting how disgusting and worthless I think myself to be, but instead, our gaze should be fixed upon the everlasting God. We should imbibe of his radiant majesty, drink full of the well of everlasting life, and be so taken with his beauty and peerless worth that, as it were, we forget ourselves all together. And so death, Abraham's and ours included, should humble us. But a second thing we see is that we should be grateful. Our dispensability should invoke gratitude in our hearts. Even though I am totally dispensable, God is still pleased to use us. One of the values of our church that we've expressed is just that, expressed gratitude. It's an essential component of combating pride. It's an essential component of the Christian life. Ingratitude is one of the chief markers of the wicked who suppress the truth that they know about God through creation, according to Paul in Romans 1. They are ungrateful. I've said this before. Gratitude isn't something that is based upon favorable conditions, circumstances in our lives. There are bad weeks and months and years. But whether we're in times of plenty or in times of want or what have you, we have the Lord Jesus, and we can be grateful for who he is, for how he has loved us. We can trust him that his promises in all the earth shall be brought to pass, and that he's guiding us wisely forever. So we want to be humble. We want to be grateful. And the third thing that our dispensability should do for us is that it should make us hopeful. Because not just now, even though God could sweep me away now and everything continue on just fine, I can be grateful that he chooses to use us in the here and now. But what about when we are actually gone? Even once we're gone, God is going to continue to bring his blessing to the world through the advance of the gospel. And one day, as Abraham expected with Isaac, and in some ways we see him expect it with Sarah, sometime after we have closed our eyes in death, there will be a resurrection that rights all the wrongs, a resurrection over which death has no sway. We shall live again and reign with Jesus as kings, queens forever. We could be hopeful because my death doesn't mean the end of God's kingdom, but it continues. And so we can be humble, we can be grateful and hopeful as we embrace the difficult truth that each of us is going to die one day. And when we do, the world will largely continue on as before. So, how do we wrap up here? I want to take a few more minutes here and think about Abraham's life in retrospective here, in retrospect. What applications can we make from his life as a whole? We've seen some things about his death, but what about his life? Some of this, if you've been here with us for the past several months, won't be terribly new, but it's a good time to sum it all up for us as we move on from Abraham here. As I said at the beginning of the sermon, there's a lot about Abraham's life that we just don't know. We know practically nothing about the first 75 years of his life. And even the 100 years of his life after that, we are only given snippets, snapshots. But what can we draw from them? Well, first of all, we see that Abraham was a man of faith who followed Yahweh wherever he led him, and we should aspire to that as well. We see this expressly stated by the author to the Hebrews. In Hebrews 11, we read, "By faith Abraham obeyed when he was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And he went out not knowing where he was going. By faith he went to live in the land of promise as in a foreign land, living in tents with Isaac and Jacob, heirs with him of the same promise." Why did he do it? Because the writer tells us he was looking forward to the city that has foundations, whose designer and builder is God. We read further in that chapter, Hebrews 11, "By faith Abraham, when he was tested, offered up Isaac. And he who had received the promise was in the act of offering up his son, of whom it was said, 'Through Isaac shall your offspring be named.' He considered that God was able even to raise him from the dead, from which, figuratively speaking, he did receive him back." And so we see in Abraham's life, in his faith did not lead him to sit on his hands, to do nothing. By faith he obeyed. He went to live. He looked forward to God's city and offered up his only son, or was in the process of doing so when the Lord stayed his hand. By faith, his wife Sarah also received the power to conceive and considered him faithful who had promised. And so it's clear from the life of Abraham that faith is living faith. It is a works-producing faith that moves the one who possesses it to act in accordance with God's commands. Of course, not perfectly, as we'll note before we're done here, but truly. We've also seen in Abraham's life that the ultimate basis of his right standing with God wasn't on the quality of the things that he did, but it was because of his union with Christ by faith. Genesis 15:6, he believed God and it was counted him as righteousness. Paul goes to great lengths to show us, particularly in Romans and Galatians, that by our own works of law, we have no hope of being reconciled to God and being brought into a right relationship with him, even remaining in a right relationship with him. It is only on the grounds of the righteousness of Christ in Christ's life, death, and resurrection, in our stead. Those are the grounds by which we may enter into or remain in right standing with God. Abraham's life teaches us that. And yet James also helps us to see, as we were just saying, that this living faith, this not dead faith, the faith that justifies alone, should never be thought to be alone, but it necessarily leads to good works of obedience to God. So much so, they're so closely tied together that James has no problem saying that Abraham was justified by his works. Now again, as we said when we looked at that he's discussing something different from what Paul is in Romans and Galatians. But James, in observing Abraham's life, as it's recorded for us in Genesis, is adamant. Abraham proves beyond a shadow of a doubt that faith and works are companions in the Christian life. They do different things, they serve different purposes, but to claim to have one without the other, James says, is nonsense. We also see that Abraham, he was a real person. He was a real person with real faith and real sins. And I think it can be easy sometimes to read Abraham's life and sort of set him on a pedestal. We view him as this impossibly righteous standard to which we will never attain. Now, you can look at Genesis 22 and think, I could never do that. I don't think I could do that if I were Abraham. It's also possible to look at parts of his life and think, I'm glad I'm not him. That's not impressive at all. He's not that impressive at the end of Genesis 12. Or in Genesis 16, or in Genesis 21. 20, offering Sarah up to Pharaoh or to Abimelech. Take her, save my life. It's not that impressive, marrying Hagar. But we shouldn't look at Abraham's life, whether it's the positive, where he follows the Lord into the promised land, he builds an altar, publicly calls upon the name of the Lord in the midst of pagans and giants and danger. Shouldn't look at him being generous to Lot, rescuing Lot from being a prisoner of war, seeking to save Lot's life when he's in Sodom, negotiating with Abimelech over the well, offering up Isaac, burying Sarah, finding a wife for Isaac. We should never look at all that and think, I could never be him, and just despair. But likewise, we shouldn't look at what he does with Sarah and Pharaoh or Hagar or Sarah and Abimelech and think, what a loser. At least I'm not as bad as that guy. Shouldn't look at all that and be filled with pride. First of all, we look at Abraham and we see the promise of God. We see that God has made promises that God is going to keep, and that God has kept and is keeping in Jesus Christ. But we can look at Abraham, and there are things that we can say, be like him here, don't be like him there. But there's the bigger point. Abraham is the tip of the spear as God confronts the sin and rebellion and suffering in the world. God called Abraham and he chose him in order that he might bring blessing to the entire world. In order that, as we saw in Genesis 18:19, that the physical seed of Abraham, Jesus, might live righteously and do justice so that the Lord may bring to Abraham what he had promised. But he doesn't bring the blessing to Abraham alone. He doesn't bring it to his physical children alone, or even primarily. He brings it to the families of the earth. And this is how Paul sums it up for us in Galatians 3:8 and 9, and how we'll end the sermon here. Paul says, in the Scripture, foreseeing that God would justify the Gentiles by faith, preached the gospel beforehand to Abraham, saying, in you shall all the nations be blessed. So then, those who are of faith are blessed along with Abraham, the man of faith. And so that's the question. Do you have faith? Have you believed in the God of Abraham, with Abraham, that you may be with him, blessed by this promise-keeping God? I pray that you have. And if you have, rejoice.